Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a story that's been buried beneath the layers of gingham and prairie roses for over a century. You think you know Laura Ingalls Wilder, the pioneer girl who inspired millions with tales of cosy log cabins and family sing-alongs. But what if I told you that between her wedding day and the moment she became America's most beloved frontier author, there's a chapter so devastating that she spent 60 years making sure you'd never read about it? This is the story of how the Dakota Prairie didn't just test one young couple, it devoured them whole, spat them out, and left scars that would shape American literature itself. August 25th, 1885. De Smet, Dakota Territory. Inside Reverend Edward Brown's modest parlour, 18-year-old Laura Elizabeth Ingalls stands in a black cashmere dress, not white. Not the virginal symbol of new beginnings that every bride is supposed to wear. Black. The kind of dress you can wear again when money is tighter than bark on a cottonwood tree. The kind of dress that says, "We're getting married, but let's not pretend this is a fairy tale." Her hands smooth the fabric one final time. The room smells like wood smoke, and the faint mustiness of prairie dust that no amount of sweeping ever eliminates. Across from her stands Almanzo James Wilder, 28 years old, 10 years her senior, with the calloused hands of a man who's been wrestling Dakota sod for 6 years. He owns land. 320 acres of it split between a homestead claim and a tree claim. In 1885 Dakota Territory, that makes him practically royalty. It also makes him a walking target for every disaster the Great Plains can manufacture. The ceremony is brief. Frontier weddings aren't known for their pageantry. Laura's parents, Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, stand witness alongside her sisters and a handful of neighbours whose names history didn't bother preserving. What history did preserve is the moment when Reverend Brown reaches the traditional vows and Laura, this quiet, determined, stubborn slip of a girl, speaks words that will echo through her entire marriage. "I will not say obey." Not a shout. Not a dramatic feminist manifesto, just a simple statement of fact delivered in a tone that could cut glass. She'll marry this man, she'll work beside him, she'll share his bed and bear his children and probably save his life more than once. But she will not promise obedience to anyone ever again. Almanzo doesn't argue. Maybe he's smart enough to recognise that the woman standing before him has a will forged in the same brutal fires that created the Dakota Prairie itself. Maybe he just doesn't care about words when the wheat crop is waiting. They exchange rings, simple bands, nothing fancy, because fancy is for people who don't need to save every penny for seed and livestock. Within an hour of saying "I do," Laura Ingalls Wilder climbs into Almanzo's wagon, and they drive north toward the homestead that will become either their kingdom or their graveyard. Spoiler alert, it becomes neither. It becomes something far worse. A slow-motion catastrophe that will take 9 years to fully destroy them. The claim shanty, measuring 12 feet by 14 feet, is now their home. 4 walls, a roof, 2 windows, a door. This is what the American dream looks like when you strip away the propaganda and the railroad posters promising paradise. Inside, there's a small stove, a bed, a table with 2 chairs, and basic supplies that Almanzo accumulated during 6 years of bachelor farming. Laura sets down her small bundle of possessions, everything she owns in the world fits in a single carpet bag, and immediately begins taking inventory. She checks the stove's condition, opens the cupboard, counts the dishes. She's not disappointed or delighted. She's calculating, already running the numbers that will determine whether they eat next winter. Outside, August sun hammers down on 320 acres of grass stretching toward a horizon, so flat it makes you understand why ancient peoples thought the earth was a pancake. This is the Dakota boom's peak moment. The railroad arrived in De Smet 5 years ago, and in its wake came thousands of settlers, each one convinced that this time, this place, their sweat and dreams will somehow succeed where basic climatology says they can't. The newspapers back east are printing stories about Dakota wheat yields that sound like lies, but technically aren't. In good years, the soil produces grain like nowhere else on Earth. What those newspapers don't mention is that good years come about as often as honest politicians. That first night, Laura and Almanzo lie in bed listening to wind move through the grass, with a sound like the ocean neither of them has ever seen. It sounds like promise. It sounds like danger. It sounds like the future bearing down on them with the inevitability of a freight train. Laura is 18 years old. She's survived childhood poverty, relentless relocations, and the long winter of 1880 to 1881 when De Smet nearly starved. She's taught school to children older than herself. She's earned her own wages and made her own decisions, and now she's bet everything, her youth, her strength, her life, on this man and this land. Almanzo is 28. He came to Dakota from a prosperous New York farming family with actual capital, which makes him luckier than 90% of homesteaders who arrived with nothing but hope and government promises. He's been farming his claim for 6 years. He knows how to break sod, plant wheat, and keep horses alive through Dakota winters that can kill livestock faster than you can say agricultural disaster. He believes, genuinely believes, that hard work and good management will overcome any obstacle. This belief will be tested in ways that would break most men, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The autumn of 1885 passes in a blur of work that redefines what Laura thought she understood about being tired. Teaching school was exhausting. Managing children, preparing lessons, maintaining order in one-room schoolhouses, where the oldest student might be bigger and meaner than you. But that was mental exhaustion, social exhaustion. This is different. This is the kind of bone-deep cellular fatigue that settles into your body and builds a permanent residence. Almanzo rises before dawn every single morning, which means Laura does too, because frontier marriages don't include the luxury of separate schedules. The horses, Skip and Barnum, a matched pair of Morgan horses that represent more capital than most settlers see in 5 years, need immediate attention. They must be fed, watered, groomed, and monitored for any sign of illness, because a sick horse means catastrophic labour loss, means failed crops, means financial ruin. The chain of causation on the frontier is ruthlessly direct and unforgiving as a bank foreclosure. Laura learns the rhythm of farm work in ways her childhood never prepared her for. Her father Charles was many things: carpenter, railroad worker, store clerk, occasional farmer, but never a successful commercial farmer. The Ingalls family moved too often, chased too many schemes, never stayed anywhere long enough to build the kind of operation Almanzo is attempting. Laura has seen farming. She's never done it at this scale, with this level of investment riding on every decision. She milks the cow before breakfast. The cow's name is Ellen, and she has opinions about how her udders should be handled. Kick you right in the ribs if you're not careful. Laura learns to speak softly, move gently, extract milk without triggering bovine rage. The milk goes into a separator, cream for butter, skim milk for drinking and cooking. Nothing gets wasted. Waste is a luxury reserved for people who've never experienced a Dakota winter. Breakfast is simple: fried salt pork, bread, coffee that's been boiled until it could strip paint. The bread is Laura's responsibility, and she bakes twice a week, kneading dough until her arms scream, managing the fire to maintain the precise temperature the oven requires. Too hot, and the bread burns to charcoal. Too cool, and it remains doughy and inedible. She learns through trial and error, through loaves that come out dense as bricks, through batches that refuse to rise despite her best efforts. By October, she produces bread that Almanzo eats without comment, which, in frontier terms, counts as high praise. After breakfast, the work divides along traditional gender lines, except the frontier has a way of obliterating traditions when survival is at stake. Almanzo heads to the fields, ploughing, preparing soil for next spring's wheat planting. Laura tends the house, but the house is 12 by 14 feet, and there are only 2 people living in it, which means housework occupies maybe 2 hours if she takes her time. The remaining daylight hours demand employment. She begins helping outside more than any respectable housewife in Spring Valley, or even De Smet would consider proper. She learns to harness horses, feeling through the leather reins when they're pulling evenly and when one is favouring a leg. She learns to stack hay, her arms developing muscles she didn't know existed. blisters forming and breaking and forming again until her palms grow calluses thick as boot leather. She learns to read weather, the particular quality of a light that precedes storms, the wind shifts that signal temperature changes, the cloud formations that promise rain versus the ones that merely threaten without delivering. The tree claim requires constant attention because the federal government, in its infinite wisdom, decided that planting trees on the treeless prairie would somehow civilize the landscape and make it suitable for Eastern agricultural methods. It's a beautiful theory with one fatal flaw. It's completely wrong. But Almanzo is locked into the system. Plant and cultivate 10 acres of trees for 8 years, and he gets an additional 160 acres of land. So Laura finds herself carrying water buckets to Cottonwood and box elder saplings, wrapping burlap around trunks to protect them from rabbits that strip bark with the efficiency of tiny lumberjacks. By November, the brutal truth of Dakota seasons asserts itself with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Temperature drops with shocking speed. One week it's pleasant autumn weather requiring maybe a jacket for morning chill. The next week it's below freezing at night, with ice forming in the water bucket inside the shanty. The wind that sounded poetic in August becomes a knife in November, cutting through every gap in the walls, every imperfect seal around windows and doors. They winterize the shanty with what they have, rags stuffed in cracks that appear overnight as if the cold itself is physically prying the boards apart. Additional layers of newspaper pasted to walls for insulation. A fire that must never go completely out because rekindling in sub-zero temperatures is both dangerous and time-consuming. Laura learns to sleep wearing nearly as many clothes as she wears during the day. She learns that washing is a luxury reserved for mild days when wet hair won't freeze solid before it dries. December brings the first blizzard, and it strikes with minimal warning. Clouds on the horizon, wind picking up, and then suddenly the world disappears into white chaos that sounds like the end of everything. Almanzo is in the barn when it hits. Laura stands at the window, heart hammering against her ribs, knowing that men have died walking from barn to house in weather like this, disoriented by blowing snow, freezing to death 20 feet from safety. She lights a lamp and sets it in the window like a beacon. 20 minutes later, 20 minutes that feel like 20 years, Almanzo stumbles through the door, beard crusted with ice, coat stiff as wood. He doesn't speak, just stands by the stove, thawing. They survive that blizzard and the dozen others that follow through sheer stubbornness and youth. They survive because surrender means abandoning the claim, losing everything they've invested, returning to their parents as failures, a fate worse than frostbite. So, they endure. And when spring finally arrives in April of 1886, it brings the kind of hope that only people who've survived a Dakota winter can fully comprehend. The snow melts, revealing grass that seemed dead but was merely dormant, a resurrection that feels almost biblical. The ground thaws, the mud becomes legendary, thick and clinging, capable of sucking boots off feet and wheels off wagons. But mud means moisture, and moisture means the possibility of crops, so nobody complains about the mud. Complaining about spring mud in Dakota is like complaining about air, pointless and embarrassing. Almanzo begins ploughing in late April, and the work is exactly as brutal as it sounds. The breaking plough cuts through sod that's never been disturbed, turning over earth that's black and rich, layered with centuries of decomposed grassroots. The railroad companies and boosters promise this soil will grow wheat like nowhere else on earth. And technically, they're not lying. In years when rainfall cooperates and temperatures behave and hail stays away, and grasshoppers don't swarm and a dozen other variables all align perfectly. The sod is so thick it requires multiple passes with the plough, the horses straining against resistance that would make lesser animals give up, Almanzo walking behind the plough for hours each day, until his legs and back develop the particular permanent ache that defines farming. By mid-May, the wheat is planted using seed Almanzo purchased on credit from the De Smet Mercantile. This is how frontier farming operates. Borrow for seed and supplies in spring, repay from harvest proceeds in fall. It works beautifully when harvests succeed. When harvests fail, the debt remains while the income disappears, and the mathematics become simple and brutal as a punch to the throat. Laura watches the wheat emerge in late May, tiny green shoots pushing through dark soil, transforming the field into something that looks almost like the prosperity the railroad posters promised. By June, the wheat stands several inches tall. By July, it reaches knee height, the heads forming, kernels developing inside those heads like tiny promises. Almanzo walks the field daily, checking for disease or pest damage, monitoring moisture levels, calculating yields in his mind with the intensity of a gambler counting cards. If the weather holds, if rain continues in moderate amounts, if hail stays away, if the hot winds that can parch a crop in days remain absent, they might harvest 30 bushels per acre. At current prices, that represents enough income to repay debts, purchase winter supplies, and maybe even save a modest amount. On December 5th, 1886, Laura gives birth to a daughter they name Rose. The birth is difficult, the recovery slow, and the timing is terrible because winter is bearing down, and there's never a good time to have a baby on the frontier, but some times are worse than others. Rose is healthy, lungs strong, grip surprisingly powerful for something so impossibly small, but she represents another mouth to feed, another body to clothe, another complication in an already precarious existence. Almanzo looks at his daughter and his wife in the fields beyond the shanty, and he makes the calculation every frontier father makes. This child will eat, will be clothed, will survive, because failure is simply not an option he can permit himself to consider. The wheat crop from 1886 was adequate, not spectacular, barely enough to cover expenses and debts, but adequate. Which means they can plant again in spring of 1887, which means they have another chance, which means the dream is still alive, except the dream is already dying. They just don't know it yet, because 1887 won't bring adequate rainfall, it will bring drought, and 1888 will bring something worse than drought, and 1889 will bring horrors that will make the previous years look gentle by comparison. But tonight, in winter of 1886, holding their newborn daughter while wind howls outside and the stove fights to keep them warm, Laura and Almanzo Wilder still believe that hard work and determination can overcome anything. They're wrong, and the Prairie is about to prove it. They're wrong, and the Prairie is about to prove it. But in April of 1887, when Almanzo plants that season's wheat crop, he has every reason to believe this year will be different. Better, even. He's learned the land. He knows the timing now, the depth to plant, the exact moment when the soil temperature transitions from hostile to cooperative. He's invested in better seed stock. Rose is 4 months old, healthy and growing, which means Laura's recovered enough from childbirth to resume full farm work. They have experience on their side now. 2 full planting seasons behind them, 2 Dakota winters survived, 2 harvests that taught them what works and what doesn't. The ploughing begins in late April, when the ground thaws enough to accept the steel blade without shattering it. Almanzo walks behind his horses, Skip and Barnum, those magnificent Morgans that represent half their net worth, guiding the plough through sod that still resists cultivation despite 2 years of breaking. Each pass cuts deeper, turning over black earth that smells rich and loamy, and full of possibility that exists nowhere except in farmers' imaginations and railroad promotional pamphlets. Sweat runs down his back despite the cool spring air. His shoulders ache with the particular burning sensation that comes from fighting physics for 10 hours straight. But this is the work. This is what separates homesteaders who succeed from those who give up and slink back east with their tails between their legs. Laura watches from the shanty door, Rose balanced on one hip, calculating distances and timelines with the precision of someone whose survival depends on accurate mathematics. If Almanzo finishes ploughing by May 10th, probable, and the seed goes in by May 20th, achievable, and the rain arrives on schedule, uncertain but historically likely, then germination should occur by early June, which means the crop will have 13 weeks to mature before harvest in late August or early September. 13 weeks, 91 days, 2,184 hours, during which approximately 10,000 variables must align correctly, or the entire enterprise collapses into debt and hunger. She's learning to think like a farmer, which is very different from thinking like a teacher or a daughter or a wife. Farmers think in probabilities and weather patterns and market fluctuations and interest rates. They think in seasons measured not by months but by growth stages: germination, tillering, stem elongation, heading, grain fill. Laura's entire childhood was spent watching her father attempt and fail at farming, always moving before the consequences caught up, always finding another scheme or opportunity elsewhere. But there's no elsewhere anymore. This is it. This claim. These 320 acres. This one chance to prove that persistence and intelligence can overcome a climate that fundamentally doesn't want them here. By mid-May, the wheat is in the ground. Almanzo has planted approximately 80 acres. Not his full capacity, but a conservative amount given their limited equipment and his solo labour. The seed represents $200 borrowed on credit from the De Smet Mercantile, where Mr. Sherwood keeps a ledger with the Wild name appearing with increasing frequency. $200 at 10% annual interest means they need to clear at least $220 from this harvest just to break even on the seed cost alone. That doesn't count equipment wear, horse feed, living expenses, the mortgage payment on the land, or the accumulated debt from previous years that sits like an uninvited guest at every meal. The wheat emerges in late May, tiny green shoots pushing through soil that's still damp from spring rains, creating rows so straight they look machine-printed. It's beautiful in the way that only potential can be beautiful before reality has a chance to ruin it. Rose, now sitting up on her own, watches from a blanket spread on the ground while Laura works the garden. The garden is Laura's domain. Potatoes, carrots, beans, squash, everything that might supplement their diet or provide something to sell if the wheat fails. Which it won't. It can't. Not this year. June brings heat that's normal for Dakota summers. 80s during the day, pleasant cool at night, occasional thunderstorms that roll across the prairie with spectacular displays of lightning, but disappointing amounts of actual rain. The wheat grows, slowly, stubbornly, fighting for every inch against soil that's drier than ideal but not yet catastrophically so. Almanzo walks the fields daily, pulling up sample plants to check root development, examining leaves for signs of rust or other diseases, mentally calculating yields based on stand density and stem thickness. If they get one good soaking rain in July, he tells Laura, they should harvest 20 bushels per acre. Maybe 25 if conditions stay favourable. Laura nods, makes bread, tends the garden, nurses Rose, and doesn't mention that 20 bushels per acre at current wheat prices, about 70 cents per bushel, generates $56 per acre, which across 80 acres equal $4,480. Subtract seed costs, equipment expenses, interest payments, and living costs, and they might clear $300 for an entire year's work, for every waking hour spent fighting this land. But $300 is $300 more than they have now, so she keeps these calculations private and keeps working. July arrives not with rain, but with heat that feels personal, vindictive, specifically designed to destroy everything the Wilders have built. The temperature climbs past 90 degrees on July 2nd and stays there. July 5th, 94 degrees. July 10th, 98 degrees. July 15th, 102 degrees. And the wind, God, the wind, shifts from its normal northerly flow to a southwesterly pattern that brings not cool relief from the mountains or moisture from the Gulf, but superheated air from the desert regions to the south and west. This is what old-timers will later call the hot winds, the Chinooks, the devil's breath. The phenomenon is meteorologically simple and agriculturally catastrophic. High-pressure systems over the Great Basin push heated, desiccated air across the plains at velocities that can strip moisture from plants faster than their roots can replace it. The air temperature at ground level reaches 110 degrees. The soil's surface temperature approaches 140 degrees. Hot enough to burn bare feet, hot enough to kill shallow-rooted plants outright. And there's no escape. No rain clouds gather. No cool front approaches. The sky is a hard, pitiless blue that looks like it's been painted on metal. Almanzo stands in his wheat field on July 20th, 1887, and watches his crop die in real time. The heads that were filling with grain 3 weeks ago are now withering, the kernels inside shrinking to half their expected size. The stalks that stood knee-high and green are turning yellow, then brown, then the colour of old bone. He can literally see them drying out hour by hour as the hot wind sucks the moisture from leaves and stems with the efficiency of a vampire. He pulls up a plant and examines the roots. They've gone deep, seeking water, but the soil is dry 8 inches down, 10 inches down, 12 inches down. The spring moisture is gone. The aquifer is too deep for wheat roots to reach. The plant is dying of thirst while standing in dirt that looks perfectly normal, but contains less moisture than the Sahara Desert. Laura brings him water at midday, carrying a jar that's already warm despite being wrapped in wet cloth. He drinks without tasting it, eyes fixed on the field with the expression of a man watching his house burn and knowing there's not a damn thing he can do to stop it. "How bad?" she asks, though she already knows. She's got eyes. She's walked past this field every day for the past month, watching it transform from promise to catastrophe. "Bad," he says finally. His voice sounds hollowed out, scraped clean of anything except factual assessment. Yield's going to be maybe 5 bushels per acre, if we're lucky, if it doesn't get worse. 5 bushels per acre across 80 acres equals 400 bushels total. At 70 cents per bushel, that's $280 gross. Subtract the $200 they borrowed for seed, and they've made $80 for an entire year's work. Except they haven't, because they still owe interest on that seed loan and equipment costs, and they need to eat. And the mercantile account has been growing every month as they buy flour and sugar and coffee, and the 1,000 small necessities that homesteaders can't produce themselves. The math is simple and brutal. They're going backward. Every day they stay on this claim, they go further into debt. Every season they plant, they dig the hole deeper, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing, they can do about it because the weather doesn't negotiate and the land doesn't care, and the bank doesn't extend credit to farmers whose crops just failed catastrophically. August brings no relief. The hot winds continue. The temperature stays locked above 95 degrees for 17 consecutive days, a record that won't be broken until the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. The wheat that might have yielded 5 bushels per acre in late July is now yielding closer to 3 bushels per acre. Almanzo harvests it anyway, because leaving it in the field would be admitting defeat, and men who admit defeat on the Dakota Prairie don't get second chances. He cuts the stalks with a scythe, binds them into shocks, hauls them to the threshing ground, and separates grain from chaff using equipment that costs more per day to operate than the grain is worth. The final yield is 240 bushels, at current prices, which have dropped to 60 cents per bushel, because drought doesn't just affect one farm, it affects the entire region, and when everyone's crop fails simultaneously, the market responds with cruel efficiency. That's $144 gross. They spent $200 on seed. They're $56 in the hole before accounting for any other expenses. The harvest of 1887 has not just failed, it has created new debt, expanded the financial crater they're standing in, and eliminated any cushion they might have had for next year's planting. Laura does the arithmetic in her head while making supper from the dwindling supplies in the cupboard. They can sell some of the horses, except horse prices have also collapsed because everyone's selling livestock they can no longer afford to feed. They can take in laundry or sewing work, except who's going to pay for laundry when the entire county is broke? They can borrow more money, except the mercantile is already nervous about their account balance, and the bank won't lend to farmers who just demonstrated they can't grow crops in drought conditions. That night, lying in bed with Rose sleeping in her cradle and Almanzo silent beside her, Laura understands something fundamental about the prairie that her father probably understood years ago, but never articulated clearly enough for her to hear. The land doesn't owe you anything. Hard work doesn't matter. Good intentions don't matter. Doing everything right doesn't matter if the sky decides to stop raining. And the sky has decided to stop raining. Autumn arrives in September with cooler temperatures that feel like mockery. Oh, now you show up with reasonable weather, now that the crops are already dead and harvested and sold for a loss? The prairie grass, more drought-tolerant than cultivated wheat, begins recovering with the September rains that arrive exactly 3 weeks too late to save anything. The landscape turns green again, lush and beautiful, and full of the kind of false promise that lures people into making catastrophic decisions like homesteading in marginal climates. Almanzo spends October preparing for winter with the grim determination of someone who knows exactly how bad things can get. He repairs gaps in the shanty walls, reinforces the roof, stacks what little hay he can afford to buy against the north side of the structure for additional insulation. He checks the horses daily for signs of illness or injury because losing an animal now would be financially devastating beyond recovery. He splits firewood until his hands bleed, creating a stack that might last through February if they're careful and lucky. Laura has taken on wage work, which in Prairie terms means she's teaching school again, at a small claim shanty 3 miles from their homestead. The school board pays $25 per month for a 12-week term, which will bring in $300, more than the failed wheat crop generated and infinitely more reliable. She walks to school Monday through Friday, teaches children ranging from age 6 to 15 in a space barely larger than their own shanty, walks home at dusk, makes supper, tends rows, manages the household, and tries not to think about what it means that her teaching income is now their primary financial support. This role reversal doesn't appear in any of the romantic frontier narratives. The strong farmer husband reduced to maintenance work while his wife brings home actual wages. The land that was supposed to provide independence instead creating dependence on the very wage labour they moved west to escape. The homestead dream transforming into a trap, where leaving means forfeiting years of invested work, but staying means slowly drowning in accumulated debt. Almanzo doesn't talk about it. Men don't, especially men whose entire identity is wrapped up in being competent, capable providers. He maintains the claim, tends the animals, splits the wood, and carries the weight of failure in silence that grows heavier every day. Laura watches him moving slower, speaking less, the lines around his eyes deepening with something that looks suspiciously like despair. She wants to tell him it's not his fault, that you can't control the weather, that drought defeats everyone eventually, but saying it out loud would make it real, would acknowledge the thing they're both pretending isn't true. They're failing. The homestead is failing. Dakota is failing them. December brings the first snow and Rose's first birthday, which they celebrate with a small cake made from precious hoarded sugar and eggs from their few remaining chickens. Rose, now walking and speaking a few words, has no idea that her parents are calculating whether they can afford to stay through spring planting, or whether they should cut their losses now and retreat to family in Minnesota. She plays with simple wooden toys Almanzo carved during long winter evenings, completely innocent of the financial disaster unfolding around her. The winter of 1887 to 1888 is cold, but not catastrophically so. Temperatures stay mostly above zero. Blizzards are infrequent and manageable. The livestock survives on minimal feed. It's the kind of winter that, under different circumstances, might feel cozy, might feel like the pioneering experience they imagined when they got married. Instead, it feels like a siege, like they're trapped in a shanty 12 feet by 14 feet with debt accumulating outside like snowdrifts, knowing that spring will bring not opportunity but another round of impossible decisions about whether to plant again or admit defeat. By February, Laura's teaching term has ended, bringing in the $300 that represents their entire liquid capital. They've used some of it to pay down the mercantile account, reducing but not eliminating their debt. They've used some to buy seed for spring planting, because what else are they going to do, not plant? They've saved exactly nothing. Zero. Their net worth, after 2.5 years of marriage and backbreaking labour, is negative. They own land they can't profitably farm, equipment they can't afford to maintain, and debt that grows every time they buy flour. And then, in late February of 1888, Rose develops a cough. Just a small cough at first, the kind every child gets during winter, except this cough doesn't go away, it gets worse. And within a week there are reports coming from town that several children in Desmet have fallen ill with something serious, something that's making their throats swell shut, something called diphtheria. Laura holds her daughter and listens to that cough rattling in Rose's small chest, and she understands with perfect clarity that the drought wasn't the worst thing that could happen to them, not even close. Because crops can fail and you can plant again next year. But if your child dies, there's no next year. There's just the empty space where they used to be, and the knowledge that the frontier doesn't just take your money and your dreams. Sometimes it takes everything. Sometimes it takes everything. Because crops can fail and you can plant again next year. But if your child dies, there's no next year. There's just the empty space where they used to be, and the knowledge that the frontier doesn't just take your money and your dreams. Sometimes it takes everything. It's late February of 1888, and Rose Wilder is 14 months old, just beginning to walk, just starting to string together words that sound almost like language, just becoming a person distinct from the helpless infant Laura gave birth to 14 months ago. She's been coughing for 3 days. Not the normal winter cough that every child gets when the temperature drops and the shanty walls leak cold air like a sieve. This cough sounds different. Wet, rattling, like something's growing in her chest that doesn't belong there. Laura holds her daughter and listens to the sound, and a cold certainty settles into her bones that has nothing to do with Dakota winter temperatures. 3 days ago, Mrs. Anderson from town mentioned that the Peterson children were sick with something serious. 2 days ago, the doctor was seen entering the Garland house at midnight. Yesterday, Reverend Brown announced that services would be shortened due to illness affecting several families. Nobody's saying the word yet. Speaking it out loud feels like inviting catastrophe. But everyone in Desmet knows what's circulating through the community. Diphtheria. The bacterium Corynebacterium diphtheria doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It starts quietly. A sore throat, a low-grade fever, fatigue that could be anything. Children are irritable, refuse food, want to be held constantly. Then the membrane forms, a greyish-white coating at the back of the throat that looks like dirty cloth and smells like death. That membrane is the signature of diphtheria, the calling card of one of the 19th century's most efficient child killers. It blocks the airway gradually, systematically, suffocating victims from the inside while their families watch helplessly. There's no treatment. Not in 1888. The antitoxin that will revolutionise diphtheria care won't be discovered for another 6 years when Emil von Behring isolates it in Germany. Right now, in Desmet, Dakota Territory, if you contract diphtheria, your survival depends entirely on your immune system's strength, your age, your general health, and luck. Mortality rates hover around 50% for severe cases. For children under 5, the odds are worse. Laura knows this. Every frontier mother knows this. Diphtheria is the nightmare that stalks the edges of every winter gathering, every church service, every trip to the mercantile where children's hands touch the same surfaces and pass invisible death between them. She's heard the stories. The Johnson family that lost 3 children in 1 week. The Brewster girl who survived but can't speak properly anymore because the paralysis affected her vocal cords. The mass grave in the cemetery that holds 11 children from the previous epidemic 5 years ago. Rose's fever climbs. Laura bathes her with cool water, holds her through the night, tries to coax her to drink liquids because dehydration kills faster than the disease itself. Almanzo hovers uselessly. Men aren't trained for sickroom care, and his particular skills involve horses and ploughs and things that respond to physical strength. A sick baby requires patience and tenderness, and the ability to function on no sleep while maintaining calm, and those are Laura's domain. On the 4th day, Rose's throat shows the telltale white patches. Laura doesn't need Dr. Cushman to confirm what she's looking at. She's nursed enough sick children during her teaching years to recognise diphtheria when she sees it. The membrane is forming. which means the next 48 to 72 hours will determine whether her daughter lives or dies, and there's nothing, absolutely nothing, Laura can do except keep her comfortable, keep her hydrated, and pray to whatever god might be listening that Rose's 40-month-old immune system is strong enough to fight off a bacterium that's been killing children since ancient Greece. Almanzo drives into De Smet to fetch Dr. Cushman despite the expense they can't afford. The doctor arrives, examines Rose's throat with professional detachment that barely conceals his concern, and delivers the prognosis Laura already knew. It's diphtheria. Keep her quiet. Fluids. Watch for signs the membrane is blocking her airway completely. If she turns blue or stops breathing, there's nothing I can do. It'll be quick. He doesn't charge for the visit because he knows the Wilders are already financially devastated, and charging dying children's parents feels obscene even by frontier medical standards. Rose fights. For 6 days. She burns with fever that makes her small body radiate heat like a stove. The membrane in her throat thickens, making swallowing painful, making breathing laboured and wheezy. She cries when she has the strength, whimpers when she doesn't. Laura holds her upright. Laying flat makes breathing harder, and sings every song she knows, tells every story she can remember, maintains a running commentary of absolute certainty that Rose will survive because the alternative is unthinkable. On the 7th day, the fever breaks. The membrane begins to loosen. Rose's breathing eases. She takes water without crying. She even smiles weakly when Almanzo makes funny faces at her. She's going to live. Against odds that killed half the children who contracted this disease, Rose Wilder is going to survive. Laura feels relief so intense it manifests as physical pain in her chest, and she allows herself exactly 5 minutes of crying before pulling herself together because there's work to do, and the farm doesn't care that her daughter almost died. Except the disease isn't finished with the Wilder family, not even close. Laura starts feeling sick on February 28th, 1888. It begins with a sore throat, normal enough after spending 6 nights sleeping, sitting up while holding a sick child. Then comes the fatigue that feels like someone poured concrete into her bones. Then the fever that makes the room shimmer and waver like heat rising off summer wheat fields. She knows immediately what's happening because she's been exposed to Rose's illness constantly for the past week, breathing the same air, touching the same contaminated surfaces, exhausting her body's defences through sleep deprivation and stress. She's contracted diphtheria, and she's the only person capable of caring for Rose and managing the household and keeping this family functional. Which means she can't afford to be sick. Too bad. Biology doesn't negotiate. Almanzo takes over Rose's care with the awkward determination of a man who's never been primary parent. He holds her, walks her when she fusses, tries to feed her the soft foods Laura prepares between bouts of fever-induced delirium. He's terrified. Laura can see it in his eyes even through the haze of her own illness. Because if Laura dies, he's a widowed father with a toddler and a failing farm and no idea how to manage any of it. The mathematics of frontier survival are ruthlessly simple. Families require 2 functional adults to survive. Lose one, and the entire structure collapses. Laura's case develops faster than Rose's did, more aggressively. The membrane in her throat grows thick and extensive, making swallowing agonizing, making breathing a conscious effort that requires focus and will. The fever spikes to 104 degrees, high enough that she loses coherent thought for periods of time, experiences the peculiar delirium where past and present blend together, and she's simultaneously a sick woman in Dakota, and a child in Wisconsin, and a teacher in a claim shanty, and all her selves existing simultaneously in fever logic. Dr. Cushman visits again, confirms the diagnosis with the grim expression of someone who's seen this story play out too many times. Keep her hydrated, he tells Almanzo. Cool compresses for the fever. If she stops breathing, it'll be quick. The same prognosis he gave for Rose. The same helpless acknowledgement that medicine in 1888 has no answers for bacterial infections that won't be treatable for another 60 years. Almanzo nurses Laura with the intensity of desperation. He holds water to her lips every hour, changes the compresses on her forehead, sits beside the bed and talks to her even when she's too feverish to respond. maintaining a running monologue about the horses and the weather and Rose's activities, anchoring her to consciousness through sheer verbal persistence. He's terrified, exhausted, and completely out of his depth. And he's doing it anyway because the alternative is watching his wife die without fighting. Laura survives. It takes 3 weeks, 3 weeks of fever and pain, and the constant feeling of suffocating, but her immune system eventually overwhelms the infection. The membrane loosens, the fever breaks. She's weak as a newborn kitten, has lost probably 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose, but she's alive. Rose is alive. They've beaten diphtheria against odds that should have killed at least one of them. Almanzo, who has not slept more than 4 hours consecutively in 3 weeks, who has maintained the household and cared for a sick toddler and nursed his dying wife simultaneously, finally allows himself to believe they're going to be okay. The worst is over. They've survived. In a few weeks, Laura will regain her strength. Spring planting season is approaching. They can rebuild from the 1887 crop failure. The diphtheria crisis is behind them. He's wrong, because sometime in the early March of 1888, while he's exhausted and stressed and his immune system is compromised from weeks of sleep deprivation and terror, Almanzo contracts diphtheria himself, and his case will be different. His case will change everything. Almanzo Wilder is 28 years old, physically powerful, the kind of man who can walk behind a plough for 12 hours straight, or lift a 200-pound sack of wheat like it weighs nothing. He's survived 6 Dakota winters. He's built a farm from raw prairie. He's the picture of frontier masculine competence, the kind of man railroad promotional materials feature in illustrations showing strong settlers taming the wilderness. If anyone should survive diphtheria with minimal complications, it's Almanzo. His case starts mild, sore throat, low fever. Nothing that seems particularly dangerous compared to what Rose and Laura survived. Dr. Cushman examines him in mid-March, confirms diphtheria, prescribes the usual useless treatment: rest, fluids, prayer. The membrane forms but doesn't grow as extensively as Laura's did. His fever stays below 103 degrees. After 10 days, the acute infection resolves. The membrane clears, his fever breaks, he's recovering. Laura, still weak herself but functional enough to resume household duties, allows herself to believe that maybe, they finally caught a break. Maybe the catastrophes are finished. Maybe they can start rebuilding. Then, in early April of 1888, approximately 2 weeks after the acute diphtheria infection resolved, Almanzo wakes up and can't move his legs properly. It starts with tingling, numbness in his feet that he initially dismisses as sleeping wrong or circulation problems from lying in bed too long during illness. But the numbness doesn't resolve. It spreads. By midday, his legs feel heavy, unresponsive, like they belong to someone else. When he tries to stand, his right leg buckles. He catches himself on the bedpost, tries again, and this time both legs refuse to support his weight. He collapses to the floor with a crash that brings Laura running from the kitchen. "I can't," he starts, then stops because finishing that sentence means admitting something catastrophic. "My legs won't work right." What's happening inside Almanzo's body is a post-infectious complication that won't be fully understood for decades. The Diphtheria bacterium produces a toxin that doesn't just affect the throat. It circulates through the bloodstream, attacking peripheral nerves, causing inflammation and demyelination. The protective coating around nerve fibers breaks down, disrupting electrical signals from brain to muscle. The condition is called diphtheritic neuropathy, and it can occur days or weeks after the acute infection resolves. Some patients recover partially, some recover fully over months or years, some never recover at all. Almanzo's case affects primarily his lower extremities, both legs, both feet, with particular severity in his right leg. The paralysis isn't complete. He can feel pressure and pain, can move his toes slightly, but functional strength is gone. He can't bear weight, can't walk, can't perform the physical labour that defines farming and masculine identity and his entire self-concept. Dr. Cushman is called again. He examines Almanzo with the professional gravity of someone delivering a death sentence for a life rather than a body. It's nerve damage from the diphtheria, he explains. The poison from the infection attacked your nerves. Sometimes it resolves, sometimes it doesn't. There's no treatment. We wait and see if function returns. They wait. Days turn into weeks. Almanzo practices walking with a cane, dragging his right leg, compensating with upper body strength. He can manage short distances with extreme effort, but the kind of sustained physical labour farming requires, walking behind a plough for hours, lifting grain sacks, climbing on and off wagons, is simply impossible. His hands also show some weakness, making fine motor tasks difficult. The strong, capable farmer who married Laura 3 years ago no longer exists. In his place is a partially disabled man who will require a cane to walk for the rest of his life. Laura watches her husband struggle with the dual loss of physical capability and identity, and she performs a calculation that frontier women have been making since humans first settled marginal lands. What can we salvage from this disaster? The answer is brutally simple. They can't farm. Not with Almanzo, unable to perform heavy labour. Not with Laura still recovering from her own diphtheria bout. Not with the crop failures and debt already crushing them. The homestead dream is finished. Dakota is finished. Everything they've built over the past 3 years is finished. But they're alive. Rose is alive. Almanzo is disabled but not dying. And somehow, from the wreckage of crop failure and disease and permanent disability, they're going to have to find a way forward. Because surrender isn't an option when you have a child depending on you. Because survival is the only acceptable outcome. Because what choice do they have except to keep going? That night, lying in bed with Almanzo sleeping restlessly beside her, and Rose breathing steadily in her cradle, Laura makes a decision that she won't articulate out loud for 6 more years. They're leaving Dakota, not today. Not next month, but soon. As soon as they can save enough money. As soon as they can find somewhere that doesn't require the kind of physical strength Almanzo no longer possesses. As soon as they can escape this prairie that has systematically destroyed every dream they brought to it. The diphtheria epidemic of 1888 didn't just make them sick. It didn't just temporarily inconvenience them. It fundamentally rewrote the trajectory of their entire lives, eliminating futures that required able bodies and replacing them with a narrower range of possibilities shaped by disability and debt, and the knowledge that sometimes the frontier doesn't just test you. Sometimes it breaks you, and you have to figure out how to live with being broken. Sometimes it breaks you, and you have to figure out how to live with being broken. This is the lesson Laura Ingalls Wilder learns in the summer of 1889, when her body tells her something she both desperately wants and absolutely cannot afford to hear. She's pregnant again. It's been nearly a year since Almanzo's diphtheria-induced paralysis transformed their lives from difficult to nearly impossible. He can walk now, barely, with a cane, dragging his right leg, gritting his teeth against pain that never fully subsides. He can perform light carpentry work for neighbours when someone's desperate enough to hire a partially disabled man. He can tend the horses with supervision, because falling while alone could mean lying helpless until Laura finds him. What he cannot do is farm, cannot break sod, cannot walk behind a plough for 10 hours, cannot lift grain sacks, cannot perform any of the physical labour that defines both agriculture and masculine identity on the Dakota frontier. Which means Laura has become the primary labourer on their claim. She's 22 years old, weighs maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, and she's doing work that would exhaust men twice her size. She plants the garden, tends the livestock, hauls water, chops wood when Almanzo's hands are too weak to grip the axe properly, walks to town for supplies because wagon trips require strength Almanzo no longer possesses, and she cares for Rose, who at 2.5 is mobile and curious and requiring constant supervision to prevent her from wandering into danger. The pregnancy makes everything exponentially harder. Morning sickness strikes with clockwork regularity, forcing Laura to pause her chores to vomit behind the shanty before resuming work. Her body aches in new ways, back pain from lifting, hip pain from the growing weight she's carrying, exhaustion that no amount of sleep can cure. And underneath everything runs a current of fear that she doesn't articulate to anyone, not even Almanzo. They can barely survive as they are. How will they manage with another mouth to feed? The math is merciless. Rose requires constant attention and resources. Almanzo requires medical care they can't afford and contributes minimal labour income. Laura is the only functional adult in the household, and pregnancy is about to eliminate that functionality for months. After childbirth, she'll be physically incapacitated for weeks, unable to perform the outdoor labour keeping them alive. They have no extended family nearby to help. Almanzo's parents are in Minnesota, Laura's parents in town are struggling themselves. They have no savings, no financial cushion, no backup plan. But biology doesn't care about backup plans. By April of 1889, Laura's pregnancy is visible. By June, she's moving slowly, carefully, conserving energy for essential tasks. The garden still needs tending. The cow still needs milking. Rose still needs feeding and supervising. Life doesn't pause for pregnancy complications, especially not on a frontier where pausing means starving. Almanzo watches his wife work through pregnancy with the expression of a man drowning and unable to help. He tries to contribute more, splitting kindling when his hands cooperate, entertaining Rose for hours to give Laura rest, cooking simple meals that don't require standing for long periods. But his limitations are brutal and unchangeable. The body that diphtheria damaged doesn't heal through willpower or determination, it just stays broken. July brings heat that makes Laura's pregnant body feel like it's cooking from the inside out. The temperature climbs past 90 degrees and stays there, day after day, turning the shanty into an oven and making any physical exertion torturous. She's 8 months pregnant now, moving like someone twice her age, every step an effort, every task a marathon. The garden is producing beans, squash, carrots that represent their primary food source, but harvesting requires bending and reaching that her swollen body struggles to perform. On August 2nd, 1889, Laura feels the first contractions. They're mild at first, easily ignored, but they intensify through the afternoon with a familiar rhythm that tells her labour has begun. Almanzo sends word to town for Dr. Cushman and Laura's mother Caroline, the two people who constitute their entire support system for childbirth. Then he boils water, prepares towels, and tries to keep Rose occupied and away from the bedroom where Laura's labour progresses from uncomfortable to agonising. The baby arrives in the early evening. A boy, small but apparently healthy, with lungs strong enough to announce his presence with vigorous crying. Dr. Cushman examines him, pronounces him normal, charges $5 they don't have, and leaves. Caroline stays through the night, helping Laura with the initial nursing, showing her how to manage two children simultaneously, providing the practical assistance that makes the difference between survival and disaster in frontier childbirth. For 48 hours, everything seems fine. The baby, whom they haven't named yet because naming feels premature, feels like tempting fate, nurses adequately. Laura recovers from childbirth with the resilience of youth. Rose adjusts to her new sibling with typical toddler confusion and occasional jealousy. Almanzo holds his son with the careful wonder of a man who understands fragility intimately. Then, on August 4th, the baby develops a fever. It starts small, a warmth to his skin that could be normal infant temperature variation. But by evening, he's noticeably hot. Too hot. The kind of heat that radiates through blankets and makes Laura's hands feel cold by comparison. She tries to nurse him, but he's lethargic, struggling to latch, falling asleep mid-feeding. His tiny face scrunches with discomfort he can't articulate. His breathing sounds different, faster, shallower, like he's working harder than he should to pull air into his lungs. Dr. Cushman returns the next morning, examines the baby with professional thoroughness that can't hide his concern, and delivers a prognosis that's both specific and useless. Infant fever. Could be any number of causes. Keep him cool. Try to get him to nurse. If he stops breathing... He doesn't finish the sentence because finishing it would mean acknowledging what frontier parents know intimately. Babies die. Frequently. From causes that won't be understood or preventable for decades. Infant mortality in 1889 hovers around 20%. 1 in 5 babies dies before their first birthday. Medicine has essentially no tools to prevent it. Laura holds her son and tries to will health into his small body through sheer maternal determination. She bathes him with cool water, holds him skin to skin to regulate his temperature, attempts to nurse him every hour even when he's too weak to eat. She doesn't sleep. Can't sleep when sleep might mean missing the moment he needs her. Almanzo takes over Rose's care completely, keeping the toddler quiet and distracted, bringing Laura water and food she doesn't taste, maintaining the household while his wife fights a battle she can't win. The fever climbs. By August 6th, the baby is barely responsive. His skin burns with heat that feels impossible for something so small to generate. His breathing is rapid and laboured. His tiny hands clench and unclench with reflexive movements that might be pain or might be the nervous system misfiring. Laura knows, has known since the fever started really, that he's dying. But knowing doesn't mean accepting, doesn't mean stopping the futile treatments, doesn't mean giving up. August 7th brings no improvement. August 8th shows slight responsiveness that Laura clings to with desperate hope that evaporates by August 9th when he refuses to nurse at all. August 10th, his breathing becomes irregular, long pauses between breaths that make Laura's heart stop until the next gasping inhale comes. August 11th, he develops a rattling sound in his chest that Dr. Cushman, making his third visit, identifies as fluid accumulation. Pneumonia, maybe, or some other respiratory failure compounding whatever initial infection started this cascade. On August 12th, 1889, approximately 12 days after his birth, Laura and Almanzo's unnamed son stops breathing. Laura is holding him when it happens, feels his small body go still, feels the terrible absence where life used to pulse. She sits frozen, cradling him, unable to process the transition from living baby to dead weight in her arms. Almanzo, standing behind her, makes a sound that's part sob and part something that has no name. They bury him the next day in the De Smet cemetery, in an unmarked grave, because headstones cost money they don't have, and because naming the grave would make the loss too permanent, too real. Reverend Brown performs a brief service attended by Laura's parents, and a handful of neighbours who understand that frontier courtesy demands witness to grief even when there's nothing to say. The grave is small, heartbreakingly small, the size of loss that never stops aching. Laura stands beside it, dry-eyed because tears feel inadequate, and makes a decision she'll maintain for the rest of her life. She will never speak publicly about this child, never write about him, never acknowledge his existence beyond the bare legal record. Some wounds don't heal. They just get buried deep enough that daily life can continue above them. The weeks following the burial pass in a fog that's part grief, part physical recovery from childbirth, part exhaustion so profound it becomes a permanent state of being. Laura's milk comes in with no baby to nurse, causing physical pain that echoes the emotional devastation. Her body recovers from pregnancy, while her mind struggles to process what that pregnancy produced. 12 days of hope, followed by an eternity of absence. Almanzo retreats into himself, going through motions of daily survival without engaging emotionally with anything. Rose, too young to understand death but old enough to sense catastrophe, becomes clingy and difficult, requiring attention Laura barely has capacity to provide. The claim sits neglected. No crops planted this spring because Almanzo couldn't work the fields, no income except the few dollars he makes from occasional carpentry, no prospect of improvement because improvement requires resources they don't possess. By September, Laura understands with brutal clarity that they cannot stay in Dakota. The land has taken too much. The crop failures, the diphtheria that crippled Almanzo, and now this, the death of their son, whose name she never speaks, add up to a debt she can't repay. They're trapped in a place that systematically destroyed every dream they brought to it, and staying means accepting slow starvation of both body and spirit. But leaving requires money they don't have and strength they've exhausted. So they stay. Not because staying makes sense, but because they lack alternatives, and the prairie, indifferent to human suffering, continues its ancient rhythm of seasons, while the Wilder family calculates how much more loss they can endure before something fundamental breaks beyond any possibility of repair. October of 1889 arrives with the kind of weather that makes Dakota almost tolerable. Cool nights, mild days, skies so blue they look painted. It's the season when people who survived another summer convince themselves that maybe next year will be different. Maybe the rain will return. Maybe the crops will grow. Maybe the impossible dream of prairie prosperity will finally materialize. Laura doesn't believe it anymore. She's 22 years old and she's buried a child and watched her husband's body betray him, an accumulated debt that grows every month like a malignant tumour. She's done believing in maybes, but she still has to eat. Rose still has to eat. Almanzo still has to eat. So she bakes bread on an October afternoon because bread is what people eat when they can't afford anything else. And their cupboard contains flour and little else. The shanty's kitchen, if you can call the corner with a stove a kitchen, measures maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. The stove is a cast-iron monster that requires constant attention to maintain proper temperature. Too hot and it scorches everything. Too cool and nothing bakes properly. Laura has been managing this stove for 4 years. She knows its temperament, its quirks, the exact placement of wood that produces ideal heat for bread. Rose is in the kitchen too, because Rose, at nearly 3 years old, is always wherever Laura is. She's playing with corn-husk dolls on the floor, chattering to herself in the running commentary toddlers maintain about their imaginary worlds. Laura half listens while managing the bread dough and fire, performing the dual consciousness that mothers develop, aware of the child, aware of the work, never fully focused on either. What happens next occurs so quickly that reconstructing the sequence becomes impossible. Laura's attention shifts to the bread. Rose moves closer to the stove. Somehow, reaching for something, stumbling against the firebox, standing too close to the open door, Rose's dress catches fire. Cotton fabric, dry as kindling, ignites instantly. The flames spread with horrifying speed, climbing from hem to waist in seconds. Rose screams. Laura lunges, grabbing her daughter, smothering the flames with her own body and hands, burning her palms and fingers in the process, but not feeling it, because the only thing that matters is stopping the fire before it reaches Rose's face and hair. She succeeds. The flames extinguish. Rose is screaming but alive, her legs burned but not catastrophically, the kind of burns that will heal with time and leave scars but won't kill her. Laura holds her daughter, checking for injury, assessing damage with the clinical precision terror produces, and doesn't notice that the fire has spread. The kitchen wall is burning. The wooden construction, tinder dry from 4 Dakota summers, catches as easily as Rose's dress did. The flames climb toward the ceiling, spreading along the tar paper exterior, finding every gap and seam, consuming the shanty with efficiency that seems almost vindictive. Laura grabs Rose and runs outside, screaming for Almanzo, who's in the barn and can't move fast enough to help. By the time he reaches the doorway, leaning on his cane, dragging his paralyzed leg, the shanty is fully engulfed. Flames pour through the windows, smoke boils into the October sky. The heat is intense enough that approaching the structure becomes impossible. Everything they own, clothing, bedding, dishes, food stores, the few possessions accumulated over 4 years of marriage, burns while they watch helplessly from the yard. There's no fire brigade in rural Dakota, no organised response, just neighbours who see the smoke and come running with buckets that prove useless against an inferno this advanced. They throw water anyway, trying to save the barn, trying to contain the spread, succeeding only in creating steam that mixes with smoke to create a fog that smells like burning dreams. The shanty burns to the ground in less than 2 hours. What remains are foundation stones, a collapsed stove, and ash. Everything else, the bed where they slept, the table where they ate, the cradle that held Rose and briefly held the son whose name they never speak, has been reduced to carbon and memory. Laura stands in the yard holding Rose, her burned hands throbbing, and performs another calculation in the endless series of calculations that define frontier survival. They have no home, no possessions, no crops, no income, accumulating debt, and winter approaching. The mathematics are simple. They're finished. Almanzo doesn't speak. There's nothing to say. You can't argue with fire, can't negotiate with ash, can't convince the universe to grant do-overs when everything you've built collapses into ruin. He just stands there, leaning on his cane, staring at the smoking remains of the homestead that was supposed to prove he could succeed, despite his disability, despite the drought, despite everything. That night they stay with Laura's parents in the small house Charles and Caroline Ingalls occupy in De Smet proper. It's temporary shelter, emergency accommodation, the kind of help family provides when catastrophe strikes. But it can't be permanent. The Ingalls household is already crowded. There's no room for another family, no capacity to support additional mouths indefinitely. Laura knows this. Almanzo knows this. They don't discuss it because discussing it would require acknowledging that they have no idea what happens next. The insurance question haunts them. Did they have fire insurance? The records don't say. Laura's later writings don't clarify. If they had it, did they let it lapse during the desperate scramble to afford food and medicine? If they never had it, why not? The answer is probably simple and brutal. Insurance costs money, and they never had money for anything beyond immediate survival. So the fire's total loss, estimated at maybe $300 worth of property, is uncompensated. They've lost everything, and they'll receive nothing. Within a week, they've moved to a rented house in town. It's small, shabby, nothing like the homestead they imagined when they married 4 years ago. But it has walls and a roof, and it doesn't require Almanzo to farmland. He can't physically work. The rent is $6 a month, which feels simultaneously cheap and impossible, given that their monthly income hovers around $10 from Almanzo's sporadic carpentry work and whatever Laura can earn from sewing or taking in laundry. This is what failure looks like on the frontier. Not a dramatic crash, but a slow, grinding descent from landowner to renter, from independent farmer to wage labourer, from hopeful newlyweds to exhausted survivors. They're 22 and 28 years old respectively, and they've experienced enough catastrophe to fill a lifetime. Crop failures, diphtheria, paralysis, infant death, house fire. Each disaster alone would be manageable. Together they represent systematic destruction of everything the homestead mythology promised. Laura sits in the rented house in November of 1889 and looks at the calendars with the expression of someone calculating escape routes. They can't stay in Dakota, that much is obvious, but they can't leave without money, and accumulating money requires time they're not sure they have. So she makes a plan, vague, desperate, but a plan nonetheless. They'll save every possible penny. They'll work whatever jobs they can find. They'll survive through another Dakota winter, and then somehow they'll leave this place that's taken everything from them. It will take them 5 more years to execute that plan. 5 years of renting in town, 5 years of odd jobs and wage work and the slow accumulation of savings that never feels like enough. 5 years of watching other families abandon their claims and flee Dakota in covered wagons headed anywhere else. 5 years of knowing they should leave but lacking the resources to go. But in November of 1889, standing in the ashes of everything they've built, Laura Ingalls Wilder makes herself a promise. The Prairie will not have the last word. She will survive this. Her family will survive this. And someday, not yet, not for decades, but someday, she will tell a version of this story that makes sense of the senseless, finds meaning in the chaos, transforms catastrophe into narrative, just not the true version. Never the version with the unnamed son buried in an unmarked grave. Never the version where her husband's body failed him, and fire consumed their home, and the American dream revealed itself as a lie told by railroad companies to sell worthless land. That version stays buried as deep as the baby in the cemetery. The version she'll eventually write will end with marriage and hope, and the promise of tomorrow. It will stop precisely where the truth becomes unbearable. And millions of readers will never know that the real story, the one about survival and loss and the weight of being broken, continued for 9 more years in Dakota before the wagon journey to Missouri finally offered something resembling escape. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones we refuse to tell, and Laura Ingalls Wilder, sitting in a rented house in De Smet in 1889, has already decided which story gets told and which story gets buried forever in prairie silence. Sometimes surrender is actually clarity, and sometimes what looks like one more desperate attempt is just the moment when you finally admit that the problem isn't you, it's the place. Because by October of 1890, Laura and Almanzo Wilder have run out of ways to blame themselves for Dakota's systematic destruction of everything they've built. They're living in a rented house in De Smet now, not even pretending to farm anymore. Almanzo does occasional carpentry work when someone's desperate enough to hire a man who walks with a cane and whose hands sometimes shake too much to hold nails steady. Laura takes in sewing when she can find it, which isn't often because half the town is as broke as they are. Rose is nearly 4 years old, asking questions about why they don't live on the farm anymore. Questions Laura answers with carefully constructed half-truths because explaining systematic economic collapse to a preschooler feels both necessary and impossible. The letter arrives in September of 1890 from Almanzo's brother Peter, who left Dakota 2 years earlier and settled in Westville, Florida, a town in Holmes County, tucked into the northwestern panhandle, where the deep south meets the Gulf Coast. Peter's letter reads like every railroad promotional pamphlet ever printed, except it comes from family, so it carries the weight of trust that boosterism never earns. The climate is mild year-round, Peter writes. No blizzards, no drought. The growing season runs 10 months. Land sells for $1 an acre. Good land, not worn-out prairie. Oranges grow. Vegetables grow year-round. And the warmth. Manny, the warmth might help your legs. The doctors down here say paralysis sometimes improves with heat and humidity. You could work again. Really work. Almanzo reads the letter 3 times before showing it to Laura. She watches his face as he hands it over, sees the desperate hope that's more painful than despair, because hope requires vulnerability, and they've been hurt too many times for vulnerability to feel safe. But what choice do they have except to hope? Staying in Dakota means slow starvation. Financial, physical, spiritual. They've already lost the farm, lost the baby, lost Almanzo's health, lost nearly a decade to a landscape that promised everything, and delivered nothing but lessons in how much a person can endure before breaking. Florida, Laura says. Not quite a question. She's never been south of Kansas, doesn't know anyone except Peter who's gone to Florida, has heard stories about heat that makes Dakota summers feel temperate, about diseases that don't exist on the prairie, about a culture so different from the Midwest that it might as well be a foreign country. But she also knows that doing the same thing and expecting different results is insanity, and they've tried Dakota enough times to know it's finished with them. Almanzo nods. We could try. Just try. If it doesn't work... He doesn't finish because they both know there is no backup plan. This is the backup plan. This is what you do when every other option has failed. You go somewhere completely different and pray that geography can solve what effort and determination couldn't. They make the decision in October. They'll go to Minnesota first, stay with Almanzo's parents in Spring Valley for rest and planning. Then they'll go to Florida. Try to establish something. A small farm, maybe. Growing crops that don't require the kind of strength Almanzo no longer possesses. Fruit, perhaps. Vegetables. Anything except wheat, which has become synonymous with failure and debt. Rose stays behind. This decision costs Laura something that won't heal for decades. Leaving your 4-year-old daughter with your parents while you travel halfway across the country to gamble on a climate cure for your husband's paralysis is not a choice anyone makes lightly. But taking Rose to Florida means exposing her to unfamiliar diseases, to heat that could kill a child, to conditions Laura can't predict or control. So Rose stays with Charles and Caroline Ingalls, and Laura boards a train heading east with a husband who can barely walk, and approximately $200, everything they've managed to save from the wreckage of their Dakota dreams. The train carries them away from De Smet on a cold October morning. Laura watches the prairie disappear through the window and feels nothing. No nostalgia, no regret. Just exhaustion, and the faint pulse of hope that Florida might be different. That warmth might heal what cold has broken. That starting over in a place with no memories might let them build something that lasts longer than Dakota allowed. They're wrong, of course, but they don't know that yet. Spring Valley, Minnesota, feels like going backward in time. Almanzo's parents, James and Angeline Wilder, live in a proper house with multiple rooms and furniture that matches and enough food that meals don't require calculating whether tomorrow's bread competes with today's. James Wilder is everything Almanzo hoped to become. A prosperous farmer who made smart choices and benefited from luck, who owns land free and clear, who never experienced the cascade of disasters that turned his son's promising start into wreckage. They stay 2 weeks. Laura sleeps in a real bed, eats 3 meals daily, and tries not to think about Rose back in Desmet. Almanzo rests, practices walking without his cane for short distances, talks with his father about Florida with the careful optimism of a man who's been wrong before and knows it. James is skeptical. Fathers usually are when their disabled sons announce plans to relocate to unfamiliar territory based on promotional letters, but he doesn't forbid it. Almanzo is 33 years old. He can make his own mistakes. They leave Minnesota in early November of 1890, boarding a train that will carry them south through Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and finally into the northwestern corner of Florida. The journey takes 3 days. Laura watches the landscape transform through the train window, flat prairie giving way to rolling hills, hills becoming forests, forests thickening into something that looks almost tropical. The trees are different. The air smells different. The people at station stops look different, sound different, move with the languid pace of those accustomed to heat. They arrive in Westville on a November afternoon when the temperature hovers around 75 degrees. It's warm, not oppressively so, but warm enough that Laura feels overdressed in the wool travel suit appropriate for Dakota November. Peter meets them at the station, looking tanned and healthy, and substantially more optimistic than Almanzo's letters from Dakota ever sounded. He loads their luggage into a wagon and drives them through town, pointing out landmarks with the pride of someone who's found success where others saw only opportunity. Westville is small, maybe 500 people, a handful of stores, a church, scattered houses, and beyond the town limits the endless pine forest that define northwestern Florida's landscape. Peter has a house on the edge of town, and a small farm where he grows vegetables and raises chickens. It's modest but functional. He's not wealthy, but he's stable, which after Dakota feels like prosperity. The land's cheap, Peter explains as they settle into the guest room he's prepared. $1 an acre for cleared land, 50 cents for forested. You can grow year-round. Tomatoes, beans, squash, whatever. Oranges further south, but up here it's too cold sometimes in January. The heat takes getting used to, but you adapt. And Manny, the warmth really does help some folks with joint troubles and such. Dr. Stevens in town says he's seen paralysis improve. Almanzo nods, already planning, already calculating, already hoping that this time, this place, things will be different. They spend the first week exploring, assessing, planning. They look at available land, sandy soil so different from Dakota's black earth that it barely seems like soil at all. They meet locals who eye these Yankee newcomers with polite suspicion, because northwestern Florida in 1890 is still recovering from Reconstruction, still processing the war that ended 25 years ago, still figuring out how northern immigrants fit into southern communities. They visit the doctor Peter mentioned, who examines Almanzo's legs with professional thoroughness and delivers an opinion that's equal parts medicine and hope. Movement and warmth sometimes restore function that cold and inactivity have diminished. Can't promise anything, but it's worth trying. By late November, they've purchased 40 acres of partially cleared land about 2 miles from Peter's place. The price is $30, so cheap compared to Dakota land values that Laura keeps checking the deed to make sure they haven't misunderstood. They build a small cabin using pine logs from the property, assisted by Peter and a couple of local men who work for wages Laura and Almanzo can barely afford. The cabin is rough, single room, dirt floor initially, gaps between logs that will require chinking, but it's shelter. It's a start. December brings the reality that promotional letters and hopeful planning obscure. Florida is hard in ways Dakota never was. The heat that seemed mild in November becomes oppressive by mid-December, when temperatures climb past 85 degrees and the humidity makes breathing feel like drowning. Laura, accustomed to Dakota's dry cold, finds the wet heat almost unbearable. Sweat soaks through clothing within minutes of starting outdoor work. Mildew grows on everything: shoes, bread, the walls of the cabin. Insects swarm with varieties and aggression unknown on the prairie. Mosquitoes that bite through fabric, flies that cluster on food, ants that invade any container not sealed perfectly. The farming is different too. The sandy soil drains too quickly, requiring constant watering. The crops are unfamiliar. Laura knows wheat and corn and prairie vegetables, but Florida demands knowledge of plants she's never seen. Pests attack with relentless efficiency. Caterpillars that strip tomato plants overnight, beetles that bore into squash vines, diseases that turn bean leaves yellow and dead within days. Peter helps, teaches what he knows, but he's only been here 2 years himself. He's still learning. By February of 1891, Laura understands that they've made another mistake. Florida isn't salvation, it's just a different kind of punishment. The malaria starts in March. At least that's Laura's best guess for what's happening when the fever strikes her with cyclical precision. Chills so violent her teeth chatter, followed by heat that makes her skin feel like it's burning, followed by drenching sweats that soak the bedding. The fever comes every other day, reliable as clockwork, leaving her weak and nauseated and unable to perform even basic tasks. There's no formal diagnosis. The doctor in Westville examines her, confirms her blood is thin and her spleen is enlarged, and prescribes quinine with the weary certainty of someone who's treated malaria 1,000 times. It's common here, he explains. The mosquitoes carry it. You'll probably deal with recurrences for years. Some people never fully clear it. Laura takes the quinine, which tastes so bitter it makes her gag, and tries to function through the fever cycles. But malaria doesn't negotiate. The fevers continue through April and into May, leaving her progressively weaker, less able to manage the household and garden work that's essential to survival. Almanzo tries to compensate, but his legs limit what he can do. Peter helps when he can, but he has his own farm to manage. And underneath the physical illness runs a deeper sickness. Laura misses Rose with an intensity that feels like physical pain. 4-year-old Rose is back in De Smet with her grandparents, living through a spring her mother isn't witnessing. Laura writes letters, short, carefully cheerful notes that don't mention the fever or the cabin's mildew or the crushing realization that Florida is failing just like Dakota failed. Rose can't read yet, so Caroline reads the letters aloud, and Laura imagines her daughter's face and aches with absence. Almanzo's legs haven't improved. The warmth and movement the doctor promised would help have done nothing. He still walks with a cane. His hands still shake. The paralysis that diphtheria created 3 years ago remains unchanged, indifferent to climate and hope, which means Florida's entire premise, that southern warmth would heal what prairie cold had broken, was false. They came here for nothing. By June, the heat has become truly dangerous. Temperatures exceed 95 degrees daily. The humidity hovers near saturation. Working outdoors between 10 in the morning and 5 in the evening risks heat stroke. The cabin, with its pine log walls and minimal ventilation, becomes an oven. Laura lies on the bed during the worst heat, too weak from malaria and exhaustion to move, and calculates how much more failure they can afford. The math is brutal. They've spent most of their savings on train tickets, on land, on building materials, on food during the months when their garden produced nothing. They're living on credit from the local mercantile, debt accumulating again just like it did in Dakota. The land they purchased isn't producing income. The crops they've managed to grow barely feed them, let alone generate surplus for sale. And Laura is sick with a disease that might recur for the rest of her life. In July of 1891, Laura tells Almanzo they're leaving. Not asking, telling. Her voice is flat, drained of inflection by fever and disappointment, and the weight of being right about something she desperately wanted to be wrong about. This isn't working. Florida isn't the answer. We need to go back to De Smet. We need Rose. We need to figure something else out because this... She gestures at the cabin, the mildewed walls, the relentless heat pressing against the windows. This is killing us slower than Dakota did, but it's still killing us. Almanzo doesn't argue. There's nothing to argue against except reality, and reality has won too many times for denial to feel like an option. He's exhausted. His legs hurt constantly in ways they didn't in Dakota, possibly because the humidity affects joints, or possibly because prolonged hope deferred manifests as physical pain. He misses Rose. He misses his daughter, with an ache that's almost worse than the failure, because at least failure he's experienced before. This particular flavour of loss, voluntary separation from your only surviving child, while chasing a cure that doesn't exist, is new. They sell the land back to the man they bought it from for $20, losing $10 in the transaction. They pack their few possessions into a trunk. They say goodbye to Peter, who wishes them well with the careful neutrality of someone who knows better than to say, "I told you so," but also knows better than to pretend this wasn't predictable. And in early August of 1891, they board a train heading north. The journey back to De Smet takes 3 days, same as the journey down. Laura watches the landscape reverse, tropical forests becoming deciduous woods, woods thinning to plains, plains flattening to prairie. The temperature drops with each mile north. By the time they cross into South Dakota, the air is dry and cool and familiar in ways that don't feel comforting so much as resigned. They're returning to the place that destroyed them because at least its destruction they understand. The train pulls into Smet on an August afternoon that's warm, but nothing like Florida's oppressive heat. Charles and Caroline Ingalls meet them at the station with Rose, who's taller than Laura remembers, talking in complete sentences, shy around the mother she hasn't seen in 10 months. Laura picks her up, feels how heavy she's gotten, how much growing happens when you're not watching, and makes herself a promise that she'll never articulate aloud but will maintain for the rest of her life. Rose will not be left again. Whatever happens next, wherever they go, Rose goes with them. Separation was supposed to protect her. Instead, it just created loss on both sides. They moved back into a rented house in De Smet. Different house. Same basic situation. Almanzo doing odd jobs, Laura sewing and taking in laundry, both of them saving money with grinding slowness toward a goal that hasn't yet defined itself, except in the negative. Not Florida, not Dakota farming. Something else. Somewhere else. But what and where remain uncertain. The Florida experiment lasted 10 months. It cost them most of their remaining savings. It gave Laura recurring malaria and Almanzo the confirmation that his paralysis is permanent. Immune to climate cures and medical optimism, it separated them from their daughter. During 10 months, they'll never recover. And it taught them a lesson that Dakota had already tried to teach, but they were too desperate to learn. Running from failure doesn't work when the failure is structural. When the problem isn't location, but the entire system of homesteading and agricultural speculation and disability in a world that demands physical strength. So they're back where they started, except poorer and sicker and more defeated. Dakota still stretches empty around them. The drought still hasn't ended. The economy is still collapsed. And somewhere in the next 3 years, they'll need to figure out what happens when even escape fails. For now, though, Laura holds Rose and tries not to calculate how many more times they can start over before there's nothing left to start with. For now, though, Laura holds Rose and tries not to calculate how many more times they can start over before there's nothing left to start with. The answer, as it turns out, is exactly once more. But first they have to earn it, dollar by dollar, month by month through nearly 3 years of labour that redefines what Laura thought she knew about exhaustion. The rented house they move into in De Smet in August of 1891 sits on 3rd Street, small and shabby and costing $6 monthly. $6 they don't reliably have. It contains 4 rooms, which feels palatial compared to Florida's cabin or the shanties they lived in on the claim. But the space doesn't change the fundamental equation. Almanzo can't farm, Laura needs work that generates cash income, and Rose needs stability after being separated from her parents for 10 months. Laura doesn't waste time mourning what Florida took from them. There's no profit in regret when rent comes due monthly, and grocers expect payment for flour. Instead, she performs the calculation that working women have been making since commerce existed. What skills can generate income, and how quickly can she convert labour into dollars? The answer arrives in multiple forms. She takes in boarders when she can find them, travelling salesmen passing through De Smet, railroad workers temporarily stationed in town, occasionally a school teacher who needs lodging during the term. Boarders pay maybe $3 to $4 weekly for room and meals, which sounds substantial until you calculate the cost of feeding an additional person and the labour required to cook, clean, and maintain standards that keep them coming back. She sews. Her skill with needle and thread developed through years of making her own clothing because buying ready-made was never an option. Translates into dressmaking for De Smet's women who can afford to pay someone else to handle the tedious work of construction. A dress might bring in $2 to $3 depending on complexity and fabric. She can complete perhaps 2 dresses weekly if she works late into the night after Rose sleeps and household tasks are finished. She takes in laundry when dressmaking work slows. Laundry pays less, maybe 50 cents to $1 per family's weekly wash, but it's reliable because people always need clean clothing, and someone always needs the work badly enough to scrub other people's dirt for coins. Laura's hands, already roughened by years of farm labour, develop a different texture from constant immersion in lye soap and hot water. The skin cracks, bleeds sometimes. She wraps her fingers in cloth when it gets bad and keeps working because stopping means not eating. Almanzo contributes what he can, which isn't much, but isn't nothing. His carpentry skills, limited now by hands that shake and legs that won't support extended standing, still suffice for small repair jobs. He can fix a neighbour's broken chair, replace warped floorboards, construct simple shelves. The work comes irregularly and pays modestly, maybe $1 for an afternoon's labour. But every dollar matters when you're trying to accumulate enough to leave. Because that's what they're doing, even if they don't articulate it directly for months. They're saving money to leave Dakota. The Florida failure taught them that running from one disaster to another solves nothing, that desperation makes poor strategy, that the next move needs planning and resources. So they save. Not the kind of saving that involves banks and interest. Banks failed by the dozens during the panic of 1893, taking depositors' money with them. They save in cash, hidden in the house, accumulating with agonizing slowness. $5 one month, $3 the next because Rose needed shoes, $7 in a good month when Laura had 3 boarders simultaneously and finished 4 dresses, $2 lost to unexpected expenses, medicine when Rose caught a cold, repairs on the stove that couldn't be deferred. The arithmetic is grinding and relentless. By the end of 1891, they have maybe $20 saved. Not enough to go anywhere. Barely enough to survive a crisis. Rose, now 5 years old, attends school in De Smet. She's bright, unnervingly so, with the kind of intellectual hunger that devours books faster than Laura can find them. She reads above her grade level, asks questions that require adult answers, remembers everything with precision that sometimes feels like accusation. She doesn't ask about Florida directly, but Laura sees the wariness in her daughter's eyes, the fear that maybe her parents will leave again, will deposit her with grandparents and disappear for another 10 months. Laura makes her a promise she doesn't speak aloud but maintains through action. They're not separating again. Whatever comes next, wherever they go, Rose goes with them. The Florida separation was supposed to protect her child. Instead, it just created different damage. That mistake won't be repeated. The winter of 1891 to 1892 passes in the rhythm of survival labour. Laura wakes before dawn, builds the fire, prepares breakfast, gets Rose ready for school, then begins the day's work, sewing or laundry or cooking for boarders or all 3 simultaneously. Almanzo does what tasks his body permits, his frustration at his limitations visible in the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands clench when he has to refuse work he physically can't perform. They eat simply, bread, beans, occasional meat when they can afford it, vegetables in season. Nothing is wasted. Rose learns to eat everything on her plate because there won't be more. They don't socialise much. Church on Sundays because community expectations demand it, and because refusing would mark them as odd, potentially damaging Laura's ability to find work. But they don't attend social gatherings, don't host dinners, don't participate in the town's social life beyond minimum necessary interaction. Partly that's economics. Socialising costs money they don't have. Partly it's energy. Laura is too exhausted for small talk. Partly it's psychological. They're ghosts in De Smet now. Former landowners reduced to renters, people who failed where others supposedly succeeded, living reminders that the homestead dream doesn't work for everyone. By spring of 1892, their savings have grown to maybe $40. It's not enough. Not nearly enough to relocate, purchase land, establish themselves somewhere new. But it's progress. Visible progress. Proof that accumulation is possible even when it feels impossible. Then May of 1893 arrives, and with it comes the panic that will reshape American economics for a generation. The Panic of 1893 doesn't announce itself with drama. There's no single catastrophic day when everything collapses simultaneously. Instead, it unfolds like slow-motion disaster. A bank failure in Philadelphia, railroad bankruptcies spreading across the country, gold reserves depleting, credit contracting, businesses closing, unemployment climbing past 20% in industrial cities. For De Smet, South Dakota, the panic manifests as the final blow to an agricultural economy already devastated by 6 years of drought. The banks that survived the 1880s start failing in the 90s. The De Smet Bank closes its doors in June of 1893, taking depositors' savings with it. People who had money yesterday have nothing today. Credit, the system that allowed farmers to buy seed in spring and repay from harvest proceeds in fall, evaporates. Mercantiles demand cash payment because extending credit to farmers who might not harvest anything feels like charity they can't afford. Wheat prices, which had been declining steadily through the 1880s, collapse completely. In 1891, wheat sold for 80 cents per bushel, low, but survivable if yields were decent. By 1894, prices have dropped to 50 cents per bushel, sometimes lower. Farmers who managed to produce crops despite the drought discover that selling their harvest doesn't cover the cost of production. They're losing money by farming. The rational response is to stop farming, but stopping means losing the land, forfeiting years of investment, admitting defeat. So the exodus accelerates. Families who stayed through the drought, who endured crop failures and debt accumulation, and the slow grinding pressure of hope deferred, finally break. They load wagons with whatever possessions they can carry and leave. Some go west to Washington or Oregon, chasing railroad promises of better land. Some go south to Kansas or Oklahoma. Some return east to whatever family they left behind, tails between legs, dreams dead. De Smet, which peaked at maybe 1,500 people during the boom years of the mid-1880s, shrinks visibly. Houses stand empty, stores close. The optimistic energy that defined the early years, the sense that this town was building towards something permanent and prosperous, dissipates into resignation. Those who remain aren't the successful ones who proved the homestead dream works. They're the people who lack resources to leave, who are trapped by debt or age or disability or simple inertia. Laura and Almanzo watch neighbours depart with expressions that mix envy and calculation. They want to leave, have wanted to leave since the house fire in '89, since Florida failed, since it became obvious that Dakota offers them nothing but memories of loss. But they can't leave broke, can't arrive somewhere new with empty pockets and no plan. The Florida disaster taught that lesson thoroughly. So they stay, they work, they save, and they watch the town empty around them. Charles and Caroline Ingalls are struggling too. Charles is 58 now, his health deteriorating in ways that age and frontier hardship create together. He's worked as a carpenter, day labourer, whatever jobs he could find, but the work has taken its toll. In 1893, he sells the house he built in De Smet, sells it at a loss because property values have collapsed along with everything else, and moves the family to smaller, cheaper quarters. Mary, Laura's blind sister, still lives with them, dependent on their care. Grace and Carrie, Laura's younger sisters, contribute what they can through teaching and odd jobs. The Ingalls family situation adds another layer to Laura's calculations. If she and Almanzo leave Dakota, they're leaving Laura's parents and sisters behind. She'll likely never see them again. Travel is expensive, visits impractical when you're barely surviving financially. Her father, whose restless mobility defined her childhood, is too old and sick to relocate again. This will be permanent separation. The thought sits in Laura's chest like a stone, heavy and cold, but it doesn't change the mathematics. Staying in Dakota means slow death, economic, physical, spiritual. Leaving means survival, even if survival costs connection to family. By the end of 1893, they've saved approximately $75. Almost enough. Not quite enough. They need $100. That's the number Laura has calculated as minimum necessary to relocate with any hope of success. $100 buys train tickets or wagon supplies, covers initial land payment somewhere, provides buffer for the first months of establishment. Less than that and they're gambling again, hoping luck compensates for insufficient resources. Laura is done gambling. So they work through another winter. Laura's hands are permanently damaged now, scarred from lye burns, joints aching from cold and overuse, fingers that sometimes refuse to grip properly. Almanzo's limp has settled into permanent fixture, his right leg dragging slightly with each step. The cane he uses worn smooth from 5 years of constant handling. Rose is 7, beginning to understand that her family is different from others, that her parents work harder for less, that poverty is their permanent condition. The drought of 1894 is among the worst on record. Spring arrives without adequate rainfall. The wheat that farmers planted with desperate optimism withers in fields that look more like desert than agricultural land. Grasshoppers return, swarms of them, biblical in scale, devouring what little vegetation survives the heat. The prairie, which had been brown and dry in previous years, turns to dust. Wind picks up the topsoil and carries it away, creating storms that darken the sky and deposit dirt on everything. This is what environmental collapse looks like. Not a single dramatic event, but accumulated degradation that crosses from difficult to impossible. The land the Ingalls family arrived to in 1879, the land that seemed to promise prosperity to anyone willing to work hard enough, has revealed itself as fundamentally unsuited to the agricultural model being imposed upon it. It's semi-arid grassland, not humid farmland. It's meant for bison and indigenous grasses, not wheat monoculture. The settlers who came here based on railroad promises and government encouragement were sold a lie. And now, 15 years later, the land is extracting payment for that lie in crop failures and dust storms and human suffering. By June of 1894, Laura and Almanzo have $105 saved. It took nearly 3 years of labour so intensive it bordered on cruelty, but they have it. $105. Enough to leave. The question is, where do they go? Laura starts researching destinations in early 1894, approaching the task with the same methodical intensity she brings to everything that matters. She can't afford another Florida, another desperate gamble on promotional promises that evaporate on contact with reality. This time, the decision needs to be strategic, informed, based on more than hope and a brother's letter. She reads everything she can find about regions that might work for a family with limited capital and a disabled farmer, agricultural journals, newspaper advertisements, railroad promotional pamphlets, which she reads with appropriate skepticism because she knows how thoroughly railroads lie. Letters from acquaintances who relocated and survived long enough to write back. She's looking for specific criteria: affordable land, adequate rainfall, climate mild enough to benefit Almanzo's chronic pain, agriculture that doesn't require the sustained heavy labour Almanzo can't provide. The Missouri Ozarks keep appearing in her research, specifically the region around Mansfield in Wright County, about 150 miles south of St. Louis, tucked into the rolling hills where the Great Plains transition to genuine forests. The promotional literature from the St. Louis-San Francisco Railway, the Frisco Line, reads like every other piece of booster propaganda. Exaggerated claims, selective truth. Promises calibrated to exploit desperation. But underneath the hyperbole, certain facts seem verifiable. The rainfall averages 40 inches annually. 40 inches. In De Smet, good years bring 17 to 20 inches. Most recent years have brought less than 15. The difference between 17 and 40 inches is the difference between crops that fail and crops that grow. It's the difference between constant anxiety about moisture and reasonable confidence that rain will come. The land is cheap. $5 to $10 per acre for cleared land, less for forested property. In Dakota, during the boom years, land sold for $20 to $50 per acre based on pure speculation. Now it's worthless, but even at peak it was overpriced. Missouri Ozark land at $5 per acre isn't speculation. It's forested hills that require clearing but come with timber that can be sold for cash. The timber matters for another reason: fuel. In Dakota, settlers bought coal or burned dried buffalo chips or twisted hay because there were no trees. Heating a house through Dakota winters consumed substantial cash. In Missouri, you cut firewood from your own property. The labor is hard, but the fuel is free. The climate is milder, not warm like Florida, not tropical and oppressive and disease-ridden, just milder than Dakota's extremes. Winter lows rarely below zero. Summer heat moderated by elevation and forest cover. The doctors Almanzo consulted in Florida were wrong about heat-curing paralysis, but chronic pain does respond to climate. Cold makes joints ache, makes damaged nerves scream, makes disability more disabling. Milder climate won't cure Almanzo, but it might make survival less agonizing. And the agriculture is diversified. The promotional materials emphasize fruit orchards, apples primarily, which grow well in Ozark soil and climate. Orchards require initial labor to establish, but once mature they're less physically demanding than field crops. An orchard can be managed by someone who walks with a cane, who can't lift heavy loads, who needs to pace work according to pain levels. Between orchard income and garden produce and poultry and dairy, a family might survive without depending on single crop agriculture's boom-bust cycle. Laura cross-references everything she can. She writes letters to people who move to Missouri, asking direct questions. Is the land actually fertile? Are the claims about rainfall true? What do orchards produce in revenue? How much capital is necessary to establish a working farm? Some letters go unanswered. Some responses are enthusiastic. People who succeeded and want to validate their choices. Some are cautious. People who moved and found it hard but survivable, which is more trustworthy than unconditional enthusiasm. By early summer of 1894, she's convinced Missouri is the best option available to them. Not perfect, not guaranteed success, but the best combination of affordable land, adequate moisture, appropriate crops for Almanzo's limitations, and distance from Dakota's environmental and economic collapse. Almanzo agrees not because he's done the research, Laura has done the research, but because he trusts her judgment and because staying in Dakota another year is unthinkable. They're leaving. They've earned the capital to leave. The only remaining question is logistics, train or wagon. Train is faster. 3 days compared to 6 weeks. It's more comfortable. It eliminates the physical labor of driving, the exposure to weather, the uncertainty of roads. But train tickets for 3 people, plus shipping their possessions, cost money they've calculated they need for land purchase. Trains also require leaving behind anything that won't fit in luggage. Furniture, tools, the accumulated material goods that represent years of acquisition. Wagon is slower, harder, more dangerous. Summer heat in Kansas can kill. But wagon allows them to bring everything, allows them to control their pace, costs nothing beyond the wagon purchase and horse feed, and they already own horses. And it provides Laura something she didn't know she needed until she started planning: autonomy. They won't be passengers depending on railroad schedules and routes. They'll be travellers making their own decisions, stopping where they choose, observing everything, documenting the journey. They choose wagon. In early July of 1894, Almanzo purchases a covered wagon and harnesses for their team. 2 black horses whose names Laura never records in her diary. The wagon is small, light, designed for distance rather than heavy hauling. They load it with clothes, bedding, cooking equipment, tools, seeds for planting once they arrive, and the $105 in cash, which Laura sews into the lining of her lap desk because carrying that much money visibly would be an invitation to robbery. On July 17th, 1894, they say goodbye. Laura's parents stand in front of their rented house, looking old and tired and smaller than Laura remembers. Charles is crying, not bothering to hide it. Caroline maintains composure with visible effort. They all know this is permanent. Laura is 27 years old. Her father is 58. By the time she might have resources to visit, if she ever has resources to visit, he'll likely be dead. She hugs him hard enough to feel his ribs through his shirt, commits the shape of his embrace to memory and climbs onto the wagon seat. Rose sits between Laura and Almanzo, 7 years old, excited about the adventure of wagon travel because 7-year-olds don't fully comprehend permanent departure. Almanzo holds the reins for the first mile out of town, his hands shaking slightly. Whether from emotion or the palsy that diphtheria created, nobody asks. Then Laura takes the reins. Her hands are steadier. Her arms are stronger from 3 years of laundry and labour. And she's the one who researched this destination, planned this route, calculated the mathematics of survival. She's driving because she's the one who can. The wagon rolls south out of De Smet on a July morning that's already hot and will get hotter. Behind them, Dakota stretches flat and brown and dying. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, Missouri waits with its 40 inches of rainfall and its forested hills and its promise of land they can afford. Laura doesn't look back. There's nothing behind her worth seeing. The future is south, uncertain and difficult and possibly just another version of failure. But at least it's movement. At least it's trying. At least it's refusing to surrender to a landscape that's taken everything except their lives and their daughter, and their capacity for one more attempt. The wheels turn. The horses pull. And the Wilder family begins the 6-week journey that will either save them or finish what Dakota started. The wheels turn, the horses pull, and the Wilder family begins the 6-week journey that will either save them or finish what Dakota started. But what Laura doesn't expect, what nobody tells you about migration, is that they won't be travelling alone, because by July of 1894, half the Great Plains is moving. The first day out of De Smet, they make maybe 12 miles before camping for the night. It's slow progress, deliberately so because pushing the horses harder in Dakota summer heat risks killing them, and dead horses means stranded family. Laura drives most of the day, her hands wrapped in cloth to prevent blisters from the reins, her body adapting to the rhythm of wagon motion that's somehow both monotonous and exhausting. Almanzo sits beside her, occasionally taking the reins when her arms need rest, but mostly just watching the landscape roll past with the expression of someone leaving a grave behind. Rose bounces between excitement and boredom the way 7-year-olds do. The first few hours are adventure, new sights, the novelty of wagon travel, the freedom from town routines. By afternoon, she's asking how much farther. When can they stop? Can she walk alongside the wagon for a while? Laura lets her walk when the road is safe and visible, keeps her in the wagon when they pass through areas that feel uncertain. The mathematics of child safety on the road are different from town safety. Out here, losing sight of your daughter for 30 seconds could mean never finding her again. They camp that first night near a dried creek bed about 15 miles south of De Smet. The land looks identical to what they left behind. Flat, brown, parched grass that crunches underfoot. Laura builds a fire from buffalo chips and twisted grass, cooks beans and cornbread, makes coffee that tastes like the ash it's boiled over. They eat in silence, too tired for conversation, then sleep in the wagon bed while prairie wind moves through the darkness around them. Day 2 brings the realization that will define the entire journey. They're not alone. By mid-morning, they encounter another wagon heading south. A family from Huron, 20 miles north of De Smet. fleeing the same drought and economic collapse. The father is maybe 40, weathered and defeated looking. His wife sits silent, 3 small children clustered around her. They exchange brief information: destinations, route conditions, warnings about road quality ahead. The conversation is clipped, functional, drained of emotion, because emotion requires energy these people don't have. By afternoon, they've passed 2 more wagons heading south. By evening, camped near the South Dakota-Nebraska border, they can see the fires of 3 other migrant families within a mile. Laura walks among the camps, not socializing, just observing, and sees the same story repeated with minor variations. Families with everything they own loaded into wagons, heading somewhere else because staying means dying. Some are going to Kansas, some to Oklahoma, some, like the Wilders, to Missouri. All of them are leaving Dakota because Dakota is finished with them. This is the reverse migration that railroad companies and government boosters will never acknowledge in their promotional materials. The promotional pamphlets that brought 400,000 people to Dakota Territory in the 1880s claimed this was permanent settlement, civilization taming the wilderness, manifest destiny fulfilled. But by 1894, more than half those settlers have left or are leaving. The garden of the world that railroad propaganda promised has revealed itself as semi-arid grassland, fundamentally unsuited to Eastern agricultural methods. And the people who believed the promises are now refugees, fleeing failure in covered wagons, carrying everything they couldn't bear to abandon. Laura writes in her diary, the small leather-bound journal where she's documenting this journey in careful handwriting. Such a lot of poor, discouraged people we meet. The sentence is clinical, observational, but underneath the restraint, Laura feels the weight of recognition. They're not special. Their failures weren't personal moral deficiencies. They were victims of a system designed to extract profit from settlers while providing none of the support necessary for success. Everyone on this road failed. And the failure was structural, not individual. Day 5 brings them to the Missouri River crossing near Yankton. The ferry cost $2, a significant chunk of their limited capital, but there's no alternative except swimming the horses across and risking everything. They wait in line for 3 hours while wagons ahead of them cross. Laura talks with other travellers, exchanges information about road conditions, learns that Nebraska is suffering the same drought as Dakota, that Kansas is marginally better but still dry, that Missouri is reportedly greener but nobody knows firsthand. The ferry crossing is terrifying in the way that simple tasks become terrifying when failure means disaster. The wagon rolls onto the flat-bottomed ferry boat, the horse is nervous about the unstable footing, Rose gripping Laura's hand hard enough to hurt. The river is low from drought but still substantial, maybe 200 feet wide, current strong enough that the ferry angles upstream during crossing to compensate for drift. Laura watches the water and calculates what happens if the ferry capsizes. They lose everything, possibly drown, definitely strand themselves on the wrong side of the river with no resources. But the ferry makes the crossing successfully, deposits them on Nebraska soil, and collects its $2. Nebraska looks identical to South Dakota, flat, dry, brown. The crops are failing here too. They pass foreclosed farms every few miles, houses standing empty, fields untended, fences sagging. Some families are still in residence, camped outside their former homes because they have nowhere else to go, waiting for what? Charity, miracle rainfall, death. Laura doesn't ask, doesn't need to. The desperation is visible in their faces, in the way they watch the passing wagons with expressions that mix envy and resignation. By the time they reach Kansas in late July, they've been on the road for 2 weeks and made maybe 200 miles. The pace is grinding. Wake at dawn, harness horses, drive for 8 to 10 hours with brief stops to rest the team, make camp, cook dinner, sleep exhausted, repeat. Laura's body adapts to the routine in ways that hurt. Her back aches constantly from wagon seat vibration. Her hands develop new calluses on top of old ones. Her face sunburns despite wearing a bonnet because Kansas sun in July shows no mercy. Rose is holding up better than Laura expected. She's adapted to wagon life with child resilience, finding ways to occupy herself during the long, monotonous hours, reading from the few books they brought, playing with a cornhusk doll, asking endless questions about everything they pass. Laura answers when she has energy, grunts non-committally when she doesn't, grateful that at least her daughter is present, visible, not left behind with grandparents in a town they'll never return to. Almanzo's physical condition remains stable but visibly limited. He can drive the wagon for short periods, but extended hours holding reins make his hands cramp and shake. He can walk short distances when they camp, but anything beyond 100 yards requires the cane and leaves him exhausted. Laura watches him struggle with tasks that should be simple, harnessing horses, lifting water buckets, gathering firewood, and feels the familiar weight of being the functional adult in a partnership where disability redistributed every role. But he's trying. She sees that, acknowledges it silently, even when frustration makes acknowledgement difficult. He tends the horses with the care of someone who knows their survival depends on these animals. He manages camp setup and breakdown. He entertains Rose with stories during evening hours when Laura is too tired to speak. He's contributing what his body permits, which is more than nothing even if it's less than necessary. Kansas is marginally greener than Nebraska, which was marginally greener than South Dakota. The progression is subtle enough that any single day's travel shows no obvious change, but comparing Kansas to the drought-devastated prairie they left behind reveals the difference. There's actual grass here. Not lush. Nothing in Kansas in 1894 qualifies as lush, but green instead of brown, living instead of desiccated. Crops are growing in some fields, struggling but present. It's the first time in weeks Laura has seen agriculture that might actually produce harvest. They encounter more migrants in Kansas, some heading west toward Colorado or California, chasing different promises, some heading south like the Wilders, looking for land that costs less than Dakota and produces more than dust. One evening, camped near a creek with adequate water for the first time in days, Laura counts 11 separate wagon camps within sight. They're all fleeing something: drought, debt, foreclosure, failure. The specifics vary, but the pattern is identical. The Great Plains experiment failed, and these are the survivors evacuating before total collapse. A man in his 50s, camped nearby, walks over to their fire after dinner. His name is Patterson, originally from Illinois, spent 8 years trying to make Dakota farming work, lost everything. Wife died 2 years ago. Fever, he says, not specifying what kind because on the frontier all fevers are potentially fatal and the distinction rarely matters. He's heading to his brother's place in Arkansas, plans to work as a hired hand because at 53 he's too old and too broke to start over independently. You folks look young enough to try again, he says, not unkindly. That's worth something. Me, I'm done trying. Just want to survive to 60, maybe see a grandchild if my daughter ever gets settled. But you got another chance in you. Laura nods. Doesn't mention that this is their third attempt, that Dakota was attempt 1, Florida was attempt 2, and Missouri is attempt 3. Doesn't mention that Almanzo's paralysis means every attempt operates with reduced capacity. Doesn't mention the baby buried in an unmarked grave, or the house fire, or the accumulated weight of losses that makes another chance feel less like optimism and more like refusal to accept defeat. Just nods and says, "We're heading to Missouri. Heard the rainfall's better." Patterson wishes them luck and returns to his camp. Laura sits by the fire after Rose and Almanzo are asleep, watching the flames and thinking about chances. How many chances does a person get? How many times can you start over before you're not starting over anymore? You're just failing repeatedly in different locations. She doesn't have answers, just knows that turning back isn't an option, so forward is the only direction that matters. The Missouri border arrives in early August, and with it comes the transformation Laura has been hoping for since they left De Smet. The landscape changes, not dramatically, not overnight, but visibly, undeniably. Hills appear where before everything was flat. Trees dot the landscape, then cluster into groves, then thicken into forests. Real forests with oak and hickory and pine, not the pathetic cottonwoods and box elders that struggle to survive Dakota's climate. The air smells different, humid instead of dry, carrying the scent of vegetation and soil instead of dust. The sky looks different. Clouds that form and sometimes actually produce rain instead of the empty blue that dominated Dakota skies for years. The temperature moderates slightly, heat still substantial, but without the scorching intensity that made Kansas afternoons feel punitive. Laura writes in her diary, "What a beautiful country." The exclamation point is rare for her. She's not given to emotional punctuation. But Missouri in August of 1894, compared to Dakota in any month of the previous 6 years, deserves enthusiasm. This is what adequate rainfall produces. Green instead of brown, growth instead of death. The possibility of agriculture that doesn't depend entirely on luck. They enter the Ozark region in mid-August. The landscape now definitively different from anything they've seen in years. Rolling hills covered with timber, streams that actually contain water, farms that look functional, houses maintained, fields cultivated, livestock visible. This isn't boom-time prosperity, isn't the agricultural paradise that railroad pamphlets promise. It's working-class subsistence farming, people making do with limited resources, but it's functioning. People are eating, crops are growing. The system, however marginally, works. Rose is wide-eyed at the trees. She's 7 years old, born in Dakota, raised on treeless prairie, briefly exposed to Florida's pine forests before illness forced their return. These Ozark hardwoods are new to her. Oak trees tall enough that she has to lean back to see their tops, hickory and walnut and trees she can't name. Laura points out varieties she recognizes from childhood in Wisconsin, before her family's restless migrations brought them to Dakota. It feels like returning to something she'd forgotten existed. Landscape with vertical dimension, where forest creates shade and timber represents wealth instead of scarcity. Mansfield, Missouri appears on August 30th, 1894, after 45 days of travel covering approximately 650 miles. It's small, maybe 500 people. One main street with scattered buildings, farms spreading out from the town centre into the surrounding hills. It's nothing like De Smet during the boom years, lacks that frantic energy of speculation and growth. It's just a town, quiet, established, unspectacular. And after 6 years of Dakota's broken promises, unspectacular looks perfect. They camp on the outskirts of town that first night, too exhausted to do more than feed the horses and themselves before collapsing into sleep. The next morning, Laura wakes before dawn and performs the calculation she's been avoiding throughout the journey. They need to turn the $105 they have left into permanent shelter and productive land. Immediately. Because camping indefinitely isn't survival. It's just postponing homelessness. Almanzo walks into town, limps into town really, his cane necessary after 6 weeks of wagon vibration aggravating his damaged legs, and makes inquiries about available land. The responses are cautiously encouraging. Land is available, prices are low. A man named J.M. Freeman has 40 acres for sale, about a mile northeast of town. Raw land, mostly forested, requiring clearing before cultivation. $400 total, or $100 down and payments on the balance. $400, 40 acres, $10 per acre, which matches Laura's research expectations. The down payment is exactly what they have minus $5 for immediate survival expenses. It's perfect in the way that perfect sometimes means exactly adequate with zero margin for error. They walk out to see the property the next day. Laura, Almanzo, Rose and Mr. Freeman leading the way. It's hill country, genuinely hilly in ways that make Dakota's flatness feel like a memory from another planet. The 40 acres sit on a ridge, sloping down toward a spring-fed stream. Timber covers most of the property. Oak, hickory, some walnut. There's a small cleared area where previous owners attempted cultivation before giving up or moving on. The soil is rocky. Ozark soil always is. Limestone outcroppings breaking through the surface, making ploughing difficult. But it's not sand like Florida, not prairie clay like Dakota. It's forest soil, dark and rich where you can access it, capable of growing fruit trees and gardens and supporting livestock. The spring provides water year-round. eliminating drought anxiety that defined their Dakota years. Laura walks the property boundaries while Almanzo discusses purchase terms with Freeman. She's calculating, always calculating. How much timber can they harvest and sell for immediate cash? How long to clear enough land for orchard planting? What will they live in while building something permanent? Where exactly should the house sit to optimize sun exposure and proximity to water? Her mind is already 3 steps ahead, planning the transformation from forested hillside to functioning farm. They make the purchase on September 2nd, 1894. $100 down payment, $300 balance due in installments. They sign papers in Freeman's office, Laura watching as Almanzo's shaking hand laboriously writes his name, the paralysis that Diphtheria created 6 years ago still visible in every letter. The deed transfers to Almanzo J. Wilder, not to Laura, because women couldn't own property in married households in Missouri in 1894. But Laura knows who'll be doing the physical work to make this land productive, knows whose labour will convert forest to farm, knows that legal ownership and functional control are different things. They have $5 left. $5. 40 acres of forested hillside, 2 horses, a wagon, basic tools, and each other. It's simultaneously everything and nothing. Everything because land ownership represents security and hope, and the possibility of building something that lasts. Nothing because they're starting from zero again. Camping on their own property because they don't have shelter, dependent on skills and labour and luck to survive the coming months. That night, camped on what's now their land, Laura sits by the fire and writes in her diary. She's exhausted, terrified, cautiously hopeful, and absolutely certain of one thing. This is their last attempt. Missouri has to work because they have no backup plan, no remaining resources for another relocation, no capacity for a 4th attempt if this one fails. They're all in. Everything they have, everything they are, bet on 40 acres of Ozark hillside and the belief that adequate rainfall and timber and fruit trees might somehow produce the life that wheat farming never could. Rose sleeps in the wagon, oblivious to the weight of adult decisions being made around her. Almanzo stares into the fire, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who's travelled 650 miles while disabled, who's bet his family's survival on one more try, who knows his physical limitations mean Laura will carry most of the burden. And Laura looks at the dark shapes of trees surrounding their camp and makes herself a promise she won't articulate for decades. If they survive this, if they manage to build something from nothing on this hillside, she will eventually write it down. Not the truth. The truth is too painful, too complicated, too full of loss and disability and failure. But a version, a story that makes sense of the senseless, that finds meaning in the struggle, that transforms these dark years into narrative. Just not yet. Not for 40 years. First, she has to survive. First, she has to build the life that will earn the right to tell the story. First, she has to prove that the 4th attempt is different from the first 3. The fire burns low. The forest sounds settle into night rhythm. And somewhere in the darkness, the future waits, uncertain, demanding, possibly catastrophic, but at least not Dakota. At least not the place that buried her son and burned her house and took her husband's legs and proved that sometimes the frontier doesn't build character. It just reveals how much suffering a person can endure before breaking. Tomorrow, they'll start building. Tomorrow they'll clear land and cut timber and plant the first apple trees that will eventually become Rocky Ridge Farm. Tomorrow they'll begin the 20-year transformation from homeless migrants with $5 to their name into established farmers whose story becomes legend. But tonight, Laura is 27 years old, broke, exhausted, and camped on raw land in Missouri. Tonight she's just a woman who refused to surrender when surrender was the logical choice. Tonight she's betting everything on 40 acres and 40 inches of rainfall and the stubborn belief that this time, this final time, the land might actually give back instead of just taking. The question is, will 40 acres and adequate rainfall be enough to heal what Dakota broke? Will timber and orchards provide the stability that wheat farming destroyed? Can a disabled farmer and his overworked wife actually build prosperity from nothing? The answers are waiting in the forest darkness, hidden in the years ahead, locked inside a future that hasn't been written yet. But one thing is certain. Whatever happens next on these 40 acres will determine whether Laura Ingalls Wilder's story ends in obscurity and failure, or becomes something that outlasts them all. In the next chapter, witness the almost impossible transformation, how Laura and Almanzo Wilder took $100, 40 rocky acres, and broken dreams, and spent the next 20 years building Rocky Ridge Farm into something neither Dakota nor Florida could destroy. Discover the back-breaking labour, the unexpected challenges, and the slow accumulation of success that would finally give Laura the stability to write the books that changed American literature forever. The journey from migrant to author is just beginning.